You're listening to a PaCCS Research production brought to you by the Partnership for Conflict, Crime and Security Research in partnership with UKRI. Hi, my name's Kate McNeil, and I'm the Communications Officer for the Partnership for Conflict, Crime and Security Research. This summer, we're sitting down with researchers who are working as part of the ESRC-funded call on Transnational Organised Crime, Deepening and Broadening Our Understanding. These projects are exploring the complex and ever-evolving socio-political and socio-technical environments within which transnational organized crime operates. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Cardiff University's Professor Michael Levi to discuss his work on how online technologies are transforming transnational organized crime. Would you mind getting started by telling me a little bit about your research background and about what brought you to working on this project?
I started out, I've got a degree in PPE, which used to mean philosophy, politics and economics. Of course, now means personal protective equipment. But that was my first degree at Oxford. And then I went to what was the only criminology postgraduate course in the UK at Cambridge. And then I did whilst I was in the course of that, I got interested in a phenomenon called long-firm fraud, which was where gangsters like the Krays and the Richardsons, some of the viewers may have seen The Long Good Friday and other similar movies, though that's sort of disappearing into the past now. But there were gangsters called the Krays and Richardsons in London who got into fraud and had basically intimidated a bunch of fraudsters and offered them also some advantages of economies of scale. And it was a mixture of those kinds of professional fraudsters and organized criminals, and also some people who normally did legitimate business, but when times were hard, they turned to bankruptcy fraud. And the ambiguity in that interested me, and I was interested also in how companies reduced their credit fraud risks and how the police and the criminal courts dealt with this phenomenon and what we knew about its effects. Now, back in 1972, when I started this PhD, that was an extremely exotic set of things to be interested in. Very few people in the world had done anything even approaching it, but it really interested me, and that was what eventually turned into a PhD in pre-computer days of 240,000 words, because nobody told me to stop. And so it grew, and I had to cut it by a third to produce a still quite long book in the Cambridge Criminology series. And ever since that, I've continued to be interested both in that in itself and also a variety of fraud projects, of money laundering projects. My first research in money laundering started in 1988, which was also an awfully long time ago, when the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police and the Deputy Chairman of one of the banks asked me to look at public-private relationships between police and banks in the light of the Brinks-Mat gold bullion robbery, where the equivalent of about £100 million worth of gold bullion in today's prices was stolen, and the gold was laundered. And this raised a variety of issues to do with what were the powers of the police, what were the obligations of the private sector. So I did that first money laundering project, something I've continued since, work on the prevention of check and credit card fraud. So I've done a wide variety of projects, as you might expect over a 45-year career, on fraud, on money laundering and organised crime. And so when the ESRC came up with its interesting initiative to ask for projects to be proposed on transnational organised crime, I and some colleagues at Cardiff who'd done work on drugs markets, on malware, on cybercrime, as well as me, thought, well, why don't we try and look at this issue of the impact of technologies on transnational organised crime. And in a sense, that was how the present project began and how it fitted into my past research areas and expertise. And yeah, it's been a very interesting project, which you're no doubt going to ask me questions about.
What are the key aims of this research, and what gap in the research does it seek to fill?
Well, at one level, it's a no-brainer to talk about technology and organised crime, because technology has always been a part of developments in crime. You could say that there's a technological arms race perpetually going on between offenders, victims or potential victims, and the police in every type of crime, in every era. One of the points that I would make is that we think of technology as being a new thing, but imagine when the telegraph was first invented, what a difference that made to the speed of transmission of money compared with steam packets going across the ocean. In terms of pure time, that was a bigger difference than from the telegraph to the internet. So it would be a mistake to think about technology as being just now. There have always been battles between safe crackers and banks and wealthy individuals, which have gone on as a continuous battle. Our aim here was to think, well, let's think about some specifically modern technologies or postmodern technologies and what effect they might have on criminal markets. For example, the dark web may no longer be seen as being new, but what impact has that made in markets for drugs, for sex, for human trafficking, and for malware? It's when we thought about this question, we thought, well, old types of markets don't just disappear. People don't stop buying their drugs from their local neighborhood drug dealer, who is probably a mate that they've known for a while, simply because the dark web comes along. After all, yeah, it may be a hard thing to think about how you negotiate with the dark web if you're not very technologically aware, or it may just be fun to continue dealing with people on the street, and it may be fun for the dealer as well. In terms of developing relationships, balancing supply and demand, purity, all of these kinds of things. So we mustn't think a priori that a dealer, normal transactions between offenders, between suppliers and demanders in illicit commodities just disappear as a result of new technologies. So what is the impact of those new technologies? How far have they ended, or how far have they replaced existing types of markets. What is the difference? Is there less violence, more violence as a result? What about prices? Is there more price knowledge? Do we have, in economist terms, a more perfect market in crime than we had before? Now, very few people have really looked at those sorts of questions. How have new technologies affected offenders' ability to recruit co-offenders to carry out these criminal tasks? We now, of course, have Facebook, other social media are available. We have lots of social media efforts, Instagram, all offering possibilities for people to meet each other, to make offers that are both licit and illicit. What evidence can we find about the way that people have taken advantage of these kinds of media for social and criminal purposes? And how has the private sector adapted to those risks? And how has policing adapted to those risks? So those were the kind of gaps in research that we noticed. And those are the kinds of gaps that we're trying to fill as well as we can. I mean, in a sense, you could say that these areas are probably, well, not in my own case, but other people's life's work to fill. That it's probably not a one-shot experience. They will continue adapting, and control will continue adapting, and those will be important phenomenon for social sciences to think about, and also for police and non-police control efforts to think about. So one of the big shifts in thinking about control of crime has been to appreciate the role of the private sector in crime prevention, but also in acting against crime, because particularly where wealthy corporations are the victims, they very often instruct investigators of one kind or another to pursue stuff. So in the cybercrime component, where wealthy individuals or corporations are the victims, they can afford to take some measures to protect themselves, but there may still be gaps in those control efforts where the victims are poor or not so wealthy, or don't believe that they will be throwing good money after bad in trying to deal with some of these important social problems of our time, which are transnational as well as local.
How have you gone about conducting this research?
Well, the research is still in progress, and COVID has affected us as it's affected many people in societies. We have to get used to this new environment, which in a way has stimulated remote working and remote criminal working, as well as remote legitimate working. So the way we went about this was partly to use existing sources in the run-up to our proposal. We sought the cooperation of private sector, police and third sector bodies to see if they would cooperate in two ways. First of all, in interviewing them about the challenges that they faced, but also in trying to get data sets that they hold and to try and analyze them, because we were interested in how does the the development of dark markets, how does that affect the social relationships between offenders and between offenders and victims? And so for that, we needed some support, but then there are also some open source databases of drug prices, for example, that some of our team had started to develop themselves. In the light of events, we started looking at malicious URLs to try to find out, what percentage around the Super Bowl, for example, of emails sent contain malicious URLs that would enable various data compromises to happen and harms to occur to the victims, whether blackmail, whether freezing their computers as a kind of ransomware, etc. So some of that data is available in the open, and we tried to develop databases to look at that data that we could find in the open. Some of it was on the dark web, and we developed techniques for collecting that kind of data for assessing, for example, what happens to the price of drugs when interventions occur in policing, when police raids, not just necessarily in one country, they could be done in collaboration with Europol or Interpol. Is there any evidence of movements in drug price and drug purity on the dark web, as well as in the open sources and street dealerships, etc. So it enabled us to test interventions on the grounds that it's very important for us to know what effects police raids against dark markets have. Do they reduce the availability or increase the price? Increasing the price sometimes might not be a good thing because it might lead to more theft in order to pay for drugs that you really need. But those are broader social policy arguments that that we can engage with. So collecting that kind of data was a challenge, but we recruited people in the University of Montreal, at the University of Sacré-Cœur in Milan, who could help us with those tasks because they were experts in those fields as well as ourselves. And so we developed, if you like, a more set of global data sets that we could play with and enable us to produce some inferences about the impacts of interventions, and also how these markets moved anyway. Were they offering a wider variety of drugs or compromised credit cards? We know that there have been a huge number of data breaches. What's the effect of that in dark markets? Does it reduce the price? Are there so many more? Are there so many more criminal opportunities than criminals can actually make use of in the process? And to the extent that large amounts of data are available from compromises, does that matter to anyone? Because the proportion of compromised data that is actually used by criminals is quite modest. And that's something for us to think about in the light of data compromise risks.
What have been some of your key findings thus far? And have you learned anything over the course of this research that surprised you?
Well, one of the things that is surprising is how the dark markets manage to rebound when they are intervened against. That doesn't mean to say that the police shouldn't be doing those interventions. I think it's very important for public reassurance that something is being done and raises the risks for criminals. But most of the effects that we've noticed about police raids, even quite major undercover operations where the FBI and the Dutch police and sometimes the British police and French police have intervened and taken over criminal markets, other markets rebound. And so that leads to a certain pessimism about what we can do. It certainly suggests that quite apart from dark markets being only a modest percentage of the total criminal markets, it makes us think quite hard about, is this a kind of silver bullet for dealing with transnational crime, or do we need to think about other methods to regulate markets, sometimes by depenalizing stuff, sometimes by looking at treatment interventions? One of our team, Luca Giamoni, has made the point recently that there's an awful lot of research on drug treatment interventions, but very little on the drug market itself or on the criminal market. So we need to worry about the nature of markets a lot more than we should. Another thing that has surprised me is there's an apparent rise, which we need to investigate a lot further, in the number of people contacted on social media to be willing to lend their bank accounts to criminals. They might not realize that they're criminals. They might shut their eyes. It's a kind of willful blindness or just blindness to what the purposes are. But they're often given excuses of one kind or another as to why their accounts are needed. But can they lend their accounts for money to flow through and then out again? So that part of money muling in the money laundering process appears to have grown very significantly. We need to understand a lot better what are the incentives and disincentives for people. Could this rise? I mean, if students are suddenly harder up because they have fewer opportunities in COVID to do part-time jobs, or because money for foreign students, say from China, may be harder to come by, are more and more people going to fall for these social media offers? So that's a big question which we've only started to explore because the money muling component has been delayed during COVID. So it's a question of, well, what are we going to be able to find out about these important phenomena? But it has surprised me the extent to which people are willing to, it's almost like a kind of hidden economy effort. Well, it's no harm, I'm just lending my account to somebody, it's not going to hurt anybody. What are the rationalizations that people employ that seem to be so much more common now than used to be the case? So is this just a function of social media being created that can be used for this purpose, or is there some other kind of selection process going on? How many offers are made that are refused, and whether we can develop a technological method for finding out how many offers are refused, we have yet to see.
Can you tell me more about your collaboration with partners at other universities?
Yes, I mean, one of the features that we've tried to develop, I mean, if transnational organized crime is a transnational phenomenon, we need to try and find the best transnational researchers to work on it. And we got researchers from the University of Montreal and from the University of Sacré-Cœur Milan, from Transcrime, to work on different aspects of the project and to try to develop databases on sex let me reformulate this. We tried to get researchers from the University of Montreal and the University of Sacré-Cœur in Milan to help us develop databases on sex transaction prices online, drug prices online, and other kinds of criminal data sets online. And one of the things that they've done is to reveal more information about the fluctuations in prices and what affects the price and availability and the kinds of things that are available in dark markets. Now, we haven't written much of that up at this stage. We've done some writing up on the online drugs data, which is now available in the drugs journals. But it's very important to not forget offline markets in this process. You can become too obsessed with online markets. So what we're planning to do is to juxtapose what's happening in online markets with that in offline markets and see what difference this really makes. So we hope to be able to provide a lot more data and a lot more insight into this once we've had the time to fully digest and assess the data ourselves.
What are the next steps for this project, and how have you sought to generate impact thus far?
It's early for us to be achieving impact because in most of the areas the research is not yet complete. But we have always at Cardiff, and I personally had the privilege of being awarded the first lifetime award for tackling economic crime last year. And we've always tried to develop relationships with government, with police, and with non-police agencies, the private sector, in all of our work. And this is no exception. So you try and develop impact in the course of doing the work, getting people to think about things that they hadn't necessarily thought that much about to start with, because everybody's terribly busy trying to do a good job operationally. And the impact of this strategically on criminal markets, on long-term, say, trust in government, etc., trust in the police, trust in private enterprise, are often not that much considered. People are just trying to do a job. So one of the advantages of having outsiders collaborating with you is to raise those more general questions. And we will be continuing with that. We're going to have seminars. I'm a senior associate fellow of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, and we'll be aiming to have some seminars towards the end with both the public and private sector, with government as well as policing bodies, to run these things at academic conferences, to write short papers, because we realize that going back to my 240,000 word PhD, nobody has time to read that. It's kind of War and Peace for criminologists. Nobody has time to read those kinds of things. So to do short policy-focused and short practice-focused, because policy wonks are not the only audience for this. If you're trying to get practitioners to do something different or to collaborate with them in getting their voice heard, you need to write shorter pieces that people will actually read. So already some of our team have written much shorter pieces in drugs journals, drugs policy journals, to try to inform and influence the academic and policy communities. It's too early to say what the effects of that are, but it's a very important thing for us. Not just to focus on academic audiences, but to try and, some of the findings are uncomfortable, because if you say to yourself, look, we know that police raids and undercover efforts to undermine particular dark markets generate a lot of good publicity, and they may also generate a lot of good public reassurance, which is a good thing. But do they necessarily have serious effects on criminal markets, on the availability and price of illicit commodities? That's an uncomfortable thing. People don't usually want to hear that their activities are less effective than they think or claim. So you need to manage those kinds of relationships quite carefully. It's not our aim to undermine the process, but that's the aim of telling truth to power. Is that you need to not just be negativistic for the sake of it, but to find both the positive and the critical things for people to try and develop better and more sophisticated strategies in the light of what we find. And to understand, we have a much more sophisticated understanding now of what transnational organized crime constitutes. It's a much looser formulation than simply looking for mafia-type organizations. Mafia-type organizations are an important component, and they cause, terror in a way that looser bodies don't. But we need to sometimes think like economists and look at these issues in markets. So that fresher way of thinking about stuff may be uncomfortable for conventional wisdom, but is what you need in order to be more genuinely effective in regulating criminal markets.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. It's much appreciated. And to all those watching, thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about PaCCS and our research, you can visit our website at www.pacsresearch.org.uk. Thanks again.